All right, so this is our final mini lecture for this particular module. And in this section, we are going to focus on Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. And I think a lot of us are familiar with the label of model minority, which we will talk about in a minute. You had some readings assigned to you about that. But it's so important again to remember the history, right? If you want to understand how immigrants are perceived today, it's important to look back at history. And they were not seen as model minority turn of the century. In fact, Chinese immigrants who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad were seen as the yellow peril, right? So as soon as the railroad was built, 1869, immediately after that, you see a spike in anti-Chinese violence that's happening. And a lot of folks think of Chinatowns as these economic hubs where you can go get a tasty meal and so on. But in fact, they arose in response to prejudice, exclusion, and institutional discrimination. And again, I say it's important to remember this history because too often Asian Americans get seduced into being seen as honorary whites, as the model minority. But we keep emphasizing that as Asian Americans, as South Asians, we're much better off investing in interracial solidarity rather than in seeing ourselves as somehow better than other minority groups. In 1882, the US passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, making Chinese the first group of illegals, right? And for the longest time, they remained the only group to be excluded by nationality until, of course, the Muslim ban was implemented. You have the image up there that says the Chinese must go. There's a lot of propaganda turn of the century, a lot of nativist propaganda, and they're just seen as too different to fit into American mainstream culture. You fast forward to modern times, and you see that they are racialized quite a bit differently as whiz kids, as good at math, right? And so when folks are asked, like, why do we see Asian Americans in present times as the model minority, people usually cite things like, well, they have really high levels of education and income, which may be true. On an average, Asian Americans have higher levels of income and education than many other groups of color. But I think it's really important to take a critical analysis and look at social, economic, political factors rather than talk about innate cultural aspects or racial stereotypes. Right? For instance, if you remember, I mentioned the 1965 Immigration Act, which selectively brought in scientists, engineers, doctors, and so on, who came and went to MIT, Caltech, Stanford, and then went and worked for the NASA. Now, when you think about it, their future generations, children of these scientists and engineers, are pretty likely to go to college. That's a function of social class status rather than innate cultural values, right? I also have an image of Jeremy Lin there just because he was seen as creating this huge sensation of being both a model minority with high GPA, but also playing basketball. But I don't know if you notice here, it says chink in the armor. So what's interesting about that is that's clearly a racial slur, just presented as a clever play on words. But there's a tendency for racism against Asian Americans to be dismissed as not quite racism. And implicating Asian Americans as part of that, as complicit in that. We have a tendency to downplay racism against our groups. And that's something we need to think about more as well. So when we look at the model minority myth, there are several different manifestations. The first question we should be asking is, model for whom? For other minority groups. And you can imagine the impact this has on racial solidarity, right? Because the argument is that this is a group of people who fare well in the US despite being non-white, which means we must be post-racial, right? And these other groups, they remain poor because of their own irresponsible behavior. So the model minority label gets weaponized as a way of saying we are post-racial, we're a meritocracy, we don't need any changes to our system because we are a fair society. There's a danger also in clubbing all Asian Americans under this one umbrella label. As you know, there's a lot of diversity within the Asian American group. That's why the reading I assigned to you by Thrupko focuses on Southeast Asians who are largely entering the US, especially folks from Laos, Cambodia, had escaped the genocidal levels of violence. And so they were coming in with a lot of trauma, very little English, right? And so they needed help, but also very specialized kinds of help. But when they were clubbed under the Asian American label, it was seen as, well, these folks are going to be fine, right? Also, if you notice a lot of resentment against Asian Americans for being very large parts of UCLA, UC Berkeley. But if you disaggregate the Asian population by Hmong, Laotian, Cambodian, you find that you have almost zero representation in these higher institutions of learning, right? Also, there's a really dark side to the model minority label. Some of you have experienced this dark side. There's a lot of pressure that comes with the label to perform, to excel. There's a lack of communication that sometimes happens between the first and second generations. And unfortunately, Asian American youth show highest levels of mental health issues like depression and anxiety. People have a lot of pressure for staying in majors that they are not interested in, and this can take a toll. Also, I wanted to share quickly from Jennifer Lee, who's a researcher, pointing out that among second generation in Spain, the Chinese exhibit lowest economic educational aspirations out of all second generation groups, including Ecuadorians, Central Americans, Dominicans, Moroccans. And I like to always present that example as a critique of the model minority label, because we have a tendency again to forget how immigrants enter a country in the first place has a big impact on what trajectories they will take, right? And the model minority myth has become mainstream thanks to Amy Chua, who wrote the book Battle Hymn of a Tiger Mom. So I think part of it is also that the Tiger Mom label, the model minority label, these are internalized by Asian Americans. And labels in that sense have a tendency to become self-fulfilling prophecies, just like we were saying with stereotypes. right? But what you'll notice is that immigrants sometimes from all parts of the world expect their children to excel. It doesn't matter if they're from Nigeria or Egypt or Iran or China or South Korea or India, right? I also wanted us to take an intersectional approach again. And that's why I wanted to share how Asian American women might be experiencing different kinds of pressures as compared to Asian American men. They're often fetishized as very submissive, they're over sexualized. This comes from actual dating websites that talk about classy Asian ladies, and I've highlighted some bits here that you can see. And it's really interesting that we see the highest rates of out marriage, that is interracial marriage, between Asian women, Asian American women, and white men, right? And it kind of laments some feminist movements that have happened. And it says that, these are women who still know how to be women, right? And at the same time, they will be financially independent. So it's a very interesting coming together that you see of stereotypes about Asian American women as submissive, and at the same time, model minority stereotypes, right? They're good with money. They're not going to be dependent on you, right? So you kind of get the best of both worlds in that sense. Asian American women also are facing more mainstream Eurocentric idealized notions of femininity. So you see that a lot in anime and manga, more Caucasian features, and the double eyelid surgery, which I present an image of over here, is the most popular form of surgery for South Koreans as well as Asian Americans, right? And this is very pervasive. There are parents who will give this as a present for high school graduation. And it's not just Asian Americans who succumb to this kind of internalized racism to conform to more Eurocentric standards of beauty. It's South Asians, it's African Americans, Latinx folks, all women of color are impacted by this. And then finally, I wanted to talk about changing the narrative. Too often, the dominant narrative remains of Asian Americans as submissive, don't make trouble, they're good techies, not good leaders, right? Because they don't have the gravitas, but they're good techies. And I wanted to share with you quickly, first of all, that Asian Americans have encountered hate crimes. That's why in your additional sources, I link you with Vincent Hu, right? Vincent Chin, who was brutally murdered, and his murderers faced very little consequences. The only silver lining was that galvanized the Asian American community, right? And then I have images of Yuri Kochiyama and Richard Aoki, who were Asian American activists. A lot of these folks had parents who were put into internment camps. They had strong links with Black Panthers. Richard Aoki was a Black Panther. Yuri Kochiyama was friends with Malcolm X. And I think those are important examples we need to share to remember that Asian Americans have always been involved in activism, have had links of racial solidarity, and they are not necessarily only submissive, right? And I think that narrative is so important to focus on if we are going to change the stereotypes about these groups. More important than ever before with what we are facing on the ground.